What if Kirby was a horror game? An absurd question to ask considering the child-friendly orientation and accessible entry level for beginners, but not so odd at a second glance. The series is no stranger to somewhat disturbing depictions of originally dinky characters, and especially back in the day, didn't hold back with actual gruesome images. It's far from real horror, but the franchise always had this slightly uneasy undertone at certain moments. Kirby 64 with its Lost Factory, Forgotten Land and the implied doomed civilization, or whole character backgrounds highlighting the tragic event they had to deal with. There's no doubt the creators like to contrast the mellow tone with occasional unobtrusive gloomy indications, which can only be found if you deal with the IP to a further degree. Receiving a full-on blatant Kirby horror game might be impossible considering the target group and risk of damaging the game's reputation severely. However, what if I would tell you there was the attempt of an actual Kirby horror experience back in the day, which was unfortunately never realized. Kirby is certainly used to experiments and famous for trying almost every genre there is. Racer, Metroidvania, platform fighter, microtransactions. Sooner or later, Kirby might cross off every possible style of gameplay. While it's fun to imagine a first-person shooter, I mean Kirby's already shooting stuff, so we are only one perspective switch away, horror may be the only threshold extremely hard to overcome without clashing with the series' principles. Smaller tests need to be done to observe potential gameplay ideas and how they could work, similar to all those eShop titles on the 3DS or Switch. In fact, the Forgotten Land is a direct result of such tests, running wild because spin-offs like Blowout Blast started to walk. If a genre like a 3D platformer needs extensive experimentation despite the natural fit for the franchise, there's no doubt a horror game has to start under similar circumstances. As I mentioned, today this could work in the form of an eShop only release, but back in the day there was a charming little entry, somewhat untraditional yet familiar in its approach. Kirby Superstar as well as its remake consist of multiple short adventures, all of them sharing the same core of being a platformer, but tweaking the rules to an extent it's hard to call them the same. The Great Cave Offensive plays out like a Metroidvania, Meta Knight's Revenge is a fast-paced run against the clock, and Gourmet Race is a culinary marathon against King DDD. The benefit of such an approach lies within the opportunity to introduce as many novel concepts as possible, without setting on one specific playstyle. It also means the creators must have brainstormed a lot of different ideas, resulting in a handful scrapped concepts I can imagine. One of those concepts is Kirby Kagero Mansion, an action horror title combined with puzzle elements. There aren't much information on this forgotten idea, with the only source of information being an interview conducted during the release of the SNES Mini during 2017 and Sakurai's own YouTube channel. Over the course of the interview, Sakurai describes Kagero Mansion as completely different from the usual Kirby game, and how they never even got start making it, despite Harold's approval. Seeing how Superstar messes with genre aspects like traditional 2D platformer, Metroidvanias, time attacks or racing, placing a short-level horror endeavor in such a party box of a game seems plausible. But what is Kagero Mansion actually all about? When Sakurai released his video on Superstar, reminiscing on the development on how certain ideas came to be, he revealed a part of the original design document highlighting information on how the prologue would start. RPG horror scenario, Kagero Mansion scenario number 6. Story. Our story starts in a deep, dense forest, one that anyone would think twice about entering. Upon chasing a butterfly into that same dark forest, Kirby is put under a wicked spell that seals his mouth shut, leaving him unable to inhale, unable to fly, and most importantly, unable to eat tasty food. The culprit? A sentient wall clock that belonged to a wizard, who perished centuries prior. To break the curse, Kirby must brave the late wizard's mansion. A cackle pieces the air, mocking Kirby, and basically every fan, considering how we will never see the rest of the document. Still, it provides us with a few interesting new facts, helping to fill the holes and find out what kind of game Kagero Mansion was supposed to be. First, let's go over the design document's headline, where the mode is revealed to be a RPG horror scenario and also scenario number 6. Scenario number 6 refers to the mode's point of order, currently held by Milky Way Wishes in the final game. We do not know if Milky Way wishes would have taken place before or after Kagero Mansion, but considering the mode, staging, length and presentation featuring Marx as the final boss, it's pretty safe to say Kagero Mansion would be unlocked as the second last adventure in the game. This might also mean it would have been comparably high in difficulty, considering the mode's placement and unusual rules. As the document follows, we get some glimpses into the game's premise, which follows a fairly basic storyline, explaining why Kirby is not able to use his mouth in any way. The main antagonist is described as a sentient wall clock, most likely the final encounter of this mode as well. I wonder if Galactic Nova bears some resemblance to this wall clock too, as it shares similarities conceptualized and might be an offspring resulting from a scrapped idea. Unfortunately, there's no concept art to go by, and I can only assume the wizard the wall clock belonged to would have been referred to in hidden lore details. The most interesting part, however, is the central gimmick of Kirby not able to inhale, fly or eat thanks to an apparent wicked spell that seals his mouth. Taking away the protagonist's trademark skill is always a great way to play with the series convention and make the player think outside the box. In Kirby's case, it's so detrimental there are basically no moves left, which is a serious cut in abilities and possibly too radical for a whole game, but perfect for a short mode like this. Going back to the interview, Sakurai states how Kirby would not be able to copy with his mouth and could use items such as candles to mimic copy abilities like fire. Of course, it's impossible to know how such an idea would play out in the end, and it sounds somewhat cryptic, but going by the headline RPG horror scenario, role-playing elements were considered too. Maybe Kirby could collect consumable items and store them in some kind of inventory, playing with resources similar to the first Resident Evil, which also took place in a mansion. Equally confusing but much more conceivable are the puzzle elements, which would probably stem from the fact Kirby cannot do much by himself. Consequently, I assume the level design to be a little interconnected, akin to the Great Cave Offensive but on a smaller scale. Not being able to fly limits Kirby's possibilities significantly, and I can imagine puzzles based on memorizing elements from certain rooms, connecting items you found for example, or burning, blocking spider webs with the aforementioned candle. An unrelated but kinda plausible comparison might be the level Dark Manor from Kirby's Epic Yarn, where Kirby cannot inhale enemies and has to navigate through a haunted mansion, with light sources illuminating the way. The very setting of a lonely mansion itself offers so much potential, there's a reason it's regularly used, even in other Kirby entries. Still, the biggest question out of the scrapped adventure remains what is meant by horror scenario. As appealing as it may sound, I don't think we can read much into it. It's probably an intriguing phrase to catch the creators and players' attention, but it was most likely never meant to be actually scary. To some extent darker, slower, more atmospheric, and for young children maybe even slightly unsettling, but not as sinister as we imagine. The reasoning behind the cancelled idea was ostensibly a lack of time and ROM space, so it was not like the very idea itself seemed unfeasible. Unfortunately, even the remake did not pick up the idea again, and we will never know if this experiment could have led to a spin-off title much bigger in scope. In fact, let's pin down how a horror-themed Kirby adventure might look like in regard to the general family-friendly tone. Coincidentally, Nintendo provides us with a perfect example from another similarly accessible franchise themselves, the Luigi's Mansion series. Especially the first game oozes an ominous atmosphere unmatched to this day. Me and many other young players actually felt scared when fighting with Luigi against ghosts, which is why Nintendo switched the tone in following successors to a more spooky comedic presentation. And this is where I see a horror Kirby title. Not necessarily frightening, but spooky enough with a few charmingly eerie enemies to fight. However, all of this may be daydreaming, as I heavily doubt Nintendo's ever going to seriously consider a horror-themed Kirby title. Still, how do you imagine Kagero Mansion to play out, and what are your ideas for an actually creepy Kirby entry? I mean, if you consider Kirby's unjustified killing spree to inhale countless innocent creatures just because he's hungry, sealing his mouth shut might actually be the most clever thing a villain has ever done.